In this video, I want to talk about something called the paths of literacy. What is a path of literacy? In the introduction, I talked about Genesis chapter 11, and I talked about a universal grammar. What if there was one grammar that fed all the different grammars? Well, I'm not going to quite get into the depth of that, but I want to do a piece of that. One of those pieces is how do we learn a language? Okay, and language is made up of acquisition order. Okay, acquisition order is simply the order that we learn language. Okay, how does that happen? Okay, the first is it begins with listening skill. Okay, and think of a child. As a child is born, what are they doing? They're not speaking yet, but they are listening, big wide eyes, taking in everything that you're saying, and they're consuming the things that are around them for that language. That's the first foundation of their grammatical functioning. The second stage is a speaking stage. Eventually that child speaks out some words. Okay, sometimes they put words together even, it depends. Different children do it differently. Some give out fragments, some give out words, some give out just little pieces of words as well. Okay, but whatever it is, they're studying now their speaking course in language development. The third is arguable. Okay, is it reading, is it writing? I believe it's writing, writing first, sorry. And writing, what they are doing is that scribble is a first stage of writing. Why am I scribbling? Because I identify that my hand actually holds language and can produce it with my writing, even if it's a scribble. What's the next stage? Hey, look at this, Mom, look at this, Dad, they want to show it to you. It has meaning behind it. Well, that's writing, okay, in its basic sense. Reading is a little bit harder. It takes a little bit longer, and it says in its first stages, let me express what I see. And a lot of times the sign that they pass over and over again, imagine a child in a car, they're always looking out the window, and you go somewhere very familiar near to your home and you see a sign, and one day they say the name on that sign. It's an amazing thing, really, is that they're soaking in that language. Or the opposite, they say that word, or they hear that word, they hear that word from somebody else, and then they identify that sign that goes with it. And they're starting to produce language. Well, that's a more advanced skill that comes a little bit later. So acquisition order is first. It is listening, speaking, writing, reading. Well, acquisition order also has a timeline to it, and the timeline is well known in research. The timeline is between birth and 5 years old, and that timeline has gaps in there, and every person is a little bit different, but by 5 years old they are beginning that reading stage. Now 5 to 7 is where reading really begins to unfold a little bit more. I don't want you to think about a child anymore, I want you to think about an adult learner. If you and I were to learn another language, we would take that same timeline, and good language teaching would come in the same order. Okay, and that tells us something. Now this gives us a marker of the world standard of learning a language. And it's well researched, it's out there. It takes 5 to 7 years to learn a language, which means at year 5, they're beginning the reading process on a good level. Well, I have some questions from this. Is how can we get a path of literacy out of that, but do it faster? Okay, if it takes 5 to 7 years, what does 2.5 years look like? Well, it looks like a child who is somewhere between speaking and writing. Well, what if we could do it that fast? Wouldn't it be amazing? Well, what would 1 year look like? Well, they're just listening, speaking now. What would 6 months look like? Just listening. What would 3 months look like? What we're going to try to do is explore a literacy program that takes 1 year. From nothing to functional reading literacy, and then on the edge of academic literacy in 1 year. Here's why. We want the church to be the expression of this literacy program. We want the church to have this in their hands, and we want them to be the expression of a God-honoring program. So we've put together a literacy program that is 1 year from end to end that begins with the natural path of language. Here's what we know in language. It goes on acquisition order. Well, what if we could shrink that down? In between acquisition order is thinking skill. Inside thinking skill is the basics of language. Remember universal grammar? It's at the foundation of all these different languages. What if we could reach down here and tap into it in its basic thought format and thought principles? If we can get to thinking before we get to even listening, and if we can get to thinking before it goes from thinking to, listening to speaking, because thinking happens there too, then we can accelerate it. And that's what we're going to try to do. We're going to walk through the steps of the literacy program, beginning with assessment and then jumping into something that develops thought language right away called SUN, Symbolic Universal Notation. I hope you'll stick with me for these next 2 steps, but I want you to think about acquisition order right now, think about how long it takes, and think about the miracle of if we could get a literacy program in less than that timeline. That's what we're going after.